Daniel Harper walked into the grand lobby of the Belmont Royal Hotel in downtown Chicago, his clothes torn and covered in street grime, his worn-out sneakers barely holding together as he dragged a tattered backpack containing everything he owned in this world. The millionaire guests stared at him with disgust as he timidly approached the magnificent Bissendorfer grand piano worth $1.8 million sitting majestically in the center of the marble hall. Security was already moving to escort him out when he whispered with a trembling voice, "Can I play something for a piece of food?" Cruel laughter filled the lobby, a street kid pretending to know how to play this masterpiece of musical craftsmanship. But when his small fingers touched the ivory keys and he began to perform Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor with a perfection that left everyone breathless, nobody knew they were witnessing the return of the son of Maestro Jonathan Harper, the legendary pianist who had died 4 years earlier. A boy who had escaped from foster care and lived on the streets, hiding a talent that would forever change their lives. But to understand how a child ended up playing for food in a luxury hotel, we need to go back to the moment when everything collapsed. Daniel had no clear memories of when his life had been normal. What he knew for certain was that 4 years ago, when he was only 7 years old, his father Jonathan Harper, the most celebrated concert pianist in the United States, had died in a plane crash or returning from a performance at Carnegie Hall in New York. His mother had passed away from leukemia when he was barely 5 years old, leaving him completely alone in the world. Imagine a 7-year-old boy who in one night lost not only his father but his entire identity. Social services took him to a group home on the outskirts of Chicago, a gray and cold place where children were numbers and where nobody believed that a street kid could really be the son of the great Maestro Harper. The documents were lost in a courthouse fire during a renovation project. There were no living relatives who could claim him, and he was too small and too traumatized to explain who he really was. At the group home, Daniel tried to tell them about the shiny black piano they had at home, about the afternoons when Daddy taught him to play, about the melodies he still heard in his head. But the caseworkers thought these were fantasies of a traumatized boy who invented a better life to cope with the reality of abandonment. Can you imagine the frustration, having a lifetime of memories and nobody believing you? At 8 years old, Daniel escaped from the group home for the first time. He couldn't stand the screaming of the other children anymore, the terrible food, the complete absence of music. He was caught and returned 3 times, but on the 4th escape he managed to disappear completely into the labyrinth of Chicago's streets, becoming invisible among the homeless and forgotten children who survived on the margins of the city. For an entire year and a half, he lived by his wits, sleeping in subway stations when it was cold, begging in front of churches, rummaging through dumpsters behind restaurants looking for leftover food. But music never abandoned him. Every time he saw a piano in shopping malls, in hotels, in music schools, he felt his fingers tingling, as if they wanted to remember what it meant to create beauty. The night before his encounter with destiny at the Belmont Royal Hotel, Daniel had slept on a bench in Millennium Park. It was late October, it was freezing, and he hadn't eaten in 3 days. He had heard about the charity gala being held at the hotel, an event to raise funds for underprivileged children. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was exactly the kind of child they were raising money for, but nobody would recognize him as such. He approached the hotel with the sole hope of asking for a bit of food, but when he entered the main hall and saw the magnificent piano in the center of the room, something inside him awakened. It was identical to the one his father played during rehearsals at home. The same Bissendorfer imperial model that he had caressed thousands of times when he was little. The guests were all wearing tuxedos and evening gowns, jewelry that sparkled under the crystal chandeliers, sophisticated conversations in different languages. He was a dirty stain in the middle of so much elegance, but he couldn't take his eyes off the piano. It was like seeing an old friend after years of separation. The hotel security was already moving to escort him outside when Daniel found the courage to ask the question that would change his life. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the elegant hall it echoed like a shout. "Can I play something for a piece of food?" The laughter that followed was cruel. A street kid pretending to know how to play an instrument worth millions of dollars was ridiculous, pathetic, almost offensive to the sophisticated guests who were there for charity, but didn't want to deal directly with the poverty they were theoretically helping. But Marcus Chen, famous music impresario and organizer of the event, had an idea. Why not let the boy make a fool of himself in front of everyone? It would be a funny moment, an anecdote to tell at cocktail parties for the next few months. He gestured for the security guards to stop and announced loudly, "All right, kid, show us what you've got. But if it's just nose, you're out of here immediately." Daniel approached the piano with his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his ears. His hands were dirty, his nails hadn't been cut in weeks, his clothes smelled of the streets and desperation. But when he sat on the bench and his fingers brushed the keys, everything changed. The first note of Rachmaninoff's prelude echoed through the hall with a crystalline purity that instantly silenced all conversation. The laughter faded, the sarcastic smiles transformed into expressions of disbelief. Daniel wasn't just playing the notes, he was living them. Each technical passage executed with a perfection that even the professional pianists present recognized as extraordinary. But what left everyone breathless wasn't just the impeccable technique of an 11-year-old beau. It was the pure emotion he transmitted through the music, a depth of feeling that spoke of losses too great for his age, of a loneliness no child should ever know, of a beauty that survived despite everything. When the last chord faded into the absolute silence of the hall, the guests remained motionless for long seconds. Then someone began to applaud, and within moments the entire room exploded in an ovation that seemed never-ending. Daniel lifted his eyes from the piano and for the first time in 4 years, he saw in the gazes of the adults not pity or discomfort, but amazement and respect. But what he didn't know was that among the audience was Margaret Sullivan, the country's leading music critic and intimate friend of the late Jonathan Harper. Margaret had immediately recognized not just the extraordinary talent, but something familiar in the way those small hands moved across the keys. It was the same delicate yet powerful touch she had seen thousands of times when Jonathan played. And when Daniel raised his face, Margaret saw in the beau's eyes the same intense and melancholic gaze of her old friend. If you're getting emotional with this story, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me which musical piece speaks to your soul. I want to know what music means to you, whether it's classical piano, rock guitar, or your grandmother's lullabies. The story isn't over yet, and what comes next will touch your heart even more deeply. Margaret Sullivan remained seated at her table long after the other guests had left the hall, watching Daniel, who had been escorted to a hotel suite by the director himself, still shocked by the performance he had witnessed. The music critic had covered Jonathan Harper's career for more than 25 years. She had watched his daughter being born and growing up, and had cried at his funeral when the boy was presumed dead along with his father. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept reliving Daniel's gestures at the piano, the way he tilted his head when facing the most difficult passages, the particular pedal technique that Jonathan had developed and that no other school taught. These couldn't be coincidences. The next morning, Margaret began her investigation. What she discovered shocked her. After Jonathan's death, Daniel had effectively disappeared from official records. Social services had a file of a Daniel with no last name. An unidentified beau found traumatized at the crash site and hospitalized for weeks. In the courthouse fire, all documents that could connect this beau to the Harper family were lost. The group home where he had been taken had records of a beau who claimed to be the son of a famous pianist, but the staff had cataloged these claims as post-traumatic fantasies. Nobody ever made the connection to Jonathan Harper, also because officially his son had died in the accident with him. A bureaucratic error that condemned a beau to 4 years of social invisibility. Margaret rushed to the hotel and asked to speak with Daniel. She found him in the suite, washed and dressed in clean clothes that the hotel staff had procured, but still visibly frightened and distrustful. When Margaret said she had been friends with his father, Daniel's eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed in years. For the first time since the accident, Daniel began to tell his true story. He remembered the night of the crash. Dad had to go to New York for a concert. He was supposed to stay home with the nanny, but at the last moment the woman had gotten sick. Jonathan decided to take Daniel with him, promising that after the concert they would get ice cream at a place he knew near the theater. The flight back had been happy. Jonathan had played magnificently. Daniel had applauded from the audience box, feeling like the proudest boy in the world. On the small private plane they sang together the songs he had taught him. Then there was the terrible news, the world spinning, the darkness. When he woke up in the hospital, everyone said Dad had died, and nobody seemed to know who he was. Margaret listened with a broken heart as Daniel recounted the 4 years that followed. The group home where nobody believed his stories, the escape through Chicago's streets, the hunger, the cold, the constant fear, but above all, the music that had kept him alive. He had continued practicing mentally the lessons Dad had taught him. He had played imaginary pianos with his fingers. When he couldn't sleep, he had sung quietly the melodies that were the only link remaining to his previous life. The definitive confirmation came when Margaret asked Daniel to play something that nobody could know unless they truly belonged to the Harper family. Daniel sat at the suite's piano and played a deeply moving melody. Margaret recognized it immediately. It was the lullaby that Jonathan had composed for his wife when Daniel was a newborn, a piece never published, never performed in public, that existed only in the private recordings Margaret had heard at the maestro's home years before. There were no more doubts. Daniel Harper, son of the piano legend, was alive. But now Margaret faced an even more complex question: how to reintegrate a traumatized boy raised on the streets into the sophisticated world of classical music, and how to manage the media impact of a discovery that would shock the entire international music community. The first step was to contact the lawyer who had managed Jonathan's estate. Officially, all of the maestro's assets had been placed in a trust fund awaiting possible heirs. The family home had been sealed. Jonathan's famous Steinway had been transferred to storage. His scores and private recordings had been preserved in a bank vault. If Daniel were legally recognized as his son, he would inherit everything. A fortune estimated at more than $18 million, plus an invaluable artistic heritage. Margaret made a decision that would change both their lives. She took Daniel to her home and began the long process of rebuilding an identity and a future. The first thing they did together was buy a piano. When Daniel saw it enter Margaret's apartment, he burst into tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of pure joy. For the first time in years he had an instrument completely his own again, a way to give voice to feelings he had kept trapped for too long. That night, Daniel played for hours, his hands recovering agility and confidence with each piece. Margaret listened from the kitchen, knowing she was witnessing something miraculous. Not just the return of an extraordinary talent, but the rebirth of a boy who had found his way back home. The news that Daniel Harper was alive exploded in the international media. Margaret managed the revelation carefully. First the DNA tests that confirmed his identity. Then a press conference that shocked the world of classical music. Discovering that the son of the great Jonathan had inherited his extraordinary talent was like finding a lost treasure. Offers came immediately. Prestigious conservatories, record labels, promoters willing to pay astronomical figures. But Margaret was determined to protect Daniel from the commercial frenzy. The boy needed time to recover emotionally and socially, with enormous educational gaps and the need to learn to trust adults again. The chosen teacher was Professor Elena Volkov, legendary Russian instructor who had trained 3 generations of world-class pianists. When she heard a recording of Daniel, she immediately changed her mind about refusing him as a student, something she rarely did at her advanced age. The first meeting was emotional. After listening to the boy play, she said that in 60 years she had never heard such pure talent, but it would take enormous work to rebuild the technique properly. Can you imagine the dedication required? Daniel practiced 8 hours a day, under Elena's strict supervision, relearning fundamentals while maintaining the emotional depth that made his playing so special. The family home was reopened. Daniel entered, after 4 years, with mixed joy and pain. Everything had remained the same, frozen in time like a museum of his previous life, but now he was the guardian of these memories and could begin to dream again. Each room brought memories that had been buried by trauma. His father's studio with the score still on the music stand, the piano where he took his first musical steps, the photographs of the happy family they once were. But Daniel was no longer alone. Margaret had become more than a protector. She was the mother figure that destiny had sent him. Elena was the rigorous, a caring teacher who challenged him to overcome his own limits. And slowly, note by note, Daniel was rebuilding not just his technique, but his soul. The first public concert, after 8 months, was an intimate recital at the Chicago Symphony Center that included pieces by his father and the lullaby dedicated to his disappeared parents. The hall was packed with music critics, former colleagues of Jonathan, and people who had followed Daniel's story in the news. The pressure was immense. Everyone wanted to know if the street kid could really live up to the Harper legacy. When Daniel walked onto the stage, wearing his first formal concert attire, he looked so small next to the massive grand piano. But when he began to play, the size difference disappeared. His interpretation of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 was technically flawless, but it was his performance of his father's original compositions that brought the house down. He played with such intimacy and understanding that it was as if Jonathan himself were channeling through his son's hands. The final piece was the lullaby, and Daniel introduced it by speaking for the first time to the audience, his voice steady despite the emotion. He said this was the last connection he had to his parents, the melody that had kept him company through the coldest nights on the streets, the promise that somewhere love still existed even when everything else had been taken away. When he finished playing, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 10 minutes. Critics wrote that they had witnessed not just a talented child, but the birth of a major artist who could honor his father's memory, while forging his own unique voice. The performance was a triumph that transformed Daniel from a frightened boy into a young artist capable of touching souls with his music. 2 years after his rediscovery, Daniel was facing the challenge of balancing emerging worldwide fame with the need to develop his own artistic identity. He had just turned 13, and was already receiving invitations to perform at major concert halls across the globe. But Margaret and Elena were careful not to push him too hard too fast. They knew that child prodigies often burned out before reaching their full potential. Daniel began to compose his own pieces, melodies that mixed the classical elegance inherited from his father with modern influences derived from his experiences on the streets. His first composition, Urban Nocturne, was a haunting piece that captured the loneliness of city nights, the sounds of traffic and distant sirens woven into a classical framework. Music professors were amazed by the maturity of his compositional voice, the way he could bridge the gap between high art and lived experience. The turning point came when Daniel organized a benefit concert for homeless children in Chicago. Unlike typical charity events where wealthy patrons attended to feel good about themselves, Daniel wanted to bring the children themselves into the concert hall. He arranged for buses to transport kids from shelters and group homes, many of whom had never heard classical music performed live. Halfway through the concert, Daniel did something unprecedented. He stopped playing and began to speak directly to the children in the audience. He told them his story with a maturity surprising for his age, speaking about the fear and hunger, but also about how music had saved him. He explained that talent could be found anywhere, that circumstances didn't define potential, that each of them had gifts waiting to be discovered. Then he invited several children onto the stage and showed them how to play simple melodies on the piano. The sight of street kids touching a concert grand piano, their faces lighting up with wonder, was more powerful than any symphony. The concert raised over $3 million to build youth centers with music programs, but more importantly, it planted seeds of possibility in dozens of young minds. But Daniel wanted to go beyond one-time charity events. He had a vision that kept him awake at night. He decided to return to the group home where he had stayed, the place of his greatest suffering. It took courage to walk through those doors again. The building looked smaller than he remembered, more worn down. The staff who had dismissed his claims about being Jonathan Harper's son were no longer there, replaced by new caseworkers who knew nothing of the famous boy who had once lived among them. Daniel organized a concert for the current residents, bringing not just his piano skills, but instruments for the children to try. He brought guitars, violins, drums, flutes, anything that could make music. He told them that each instrument was a key that could open doors they didn't know existed. With the funds he raised, Daniel financed more accurate family search programs at the group home and established weekly music classes taught by volunteers from the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. He wanted to transform the place of his suffering into a place of opportunity for others. Can you imagine the courage that required to return to the place that represented his greatest trauma, but now as a symbol of hope for other children living the same situation he had lived? The transformation wasn't just in the building or the programs. It was in the children's faces when they realized that someone who had been exactly where they were had made it out, had thrived, and had come back for them. At 14 years old, Daniel had become more than a talented pianist. He had become a symbol of resilience and a voice for the forgotten. His second major composition, Streets of Memory, was a suite that musically narrated his journey from loss to rebirth, from darkness to light. Each movement represented a different stage: the accident, the confusion of foster care, the desperation of homelessness, the moment at the hotel piano, the rediscovery of identity, and finally, the commitment to help others. The premiere at Symphony Center was a multimedia event with projections showing images of homeless children, statistics about kids in foster care, and ultimately, photos of success stories from Daniel's programs. It wasn't just a concert, it was a call to action. Daniel's most ambitious project began to take shape when he was 16. He proposed creating the Daniel Harper Academy, a full conservatory specifically for children from difficult circumstances. It wouldn't be a charity program with watered-down instruction, but a world-class institution that happened to serve underprivileged youth. The idea was revolutionary and controversial. Many in the classical music establishment questioned whether street kids could really handle the rigors of professional musical training. But Daniel and Margaret pushed forward, raising funds from wealthy donors and securing a beautiful old building in downtown Chicago that had once been a luxury hotel that had fallen into disrepair. The renovation took 18 months and cost $22 million, most of it coming from Daniel's inheritance and his fundraising concerts. When the Daniel Harper Academy opened its doors, Daniel personally conducted auditions at group homes, shelters, and community centers across the city. He wasn't looking for children who already played instruments perfectly. He was looking for that spark, that hunger, that desperate need for beauty that he recognized in himself. The first class had 38 students ranging from age 7 to 17. Many had never touched an instrument before. Some were dealing with trauma, learning disabilities, behavioral issues, all the complications that came from difficult childhoods. But every single one of them had potential. The teaching approach was unique. Yes, they learned music theory and technique with the same rigor as any elite conservatory. But they also had counselors, therapists, mentors who understood that you couldn't separate musical development from emotional healing. Students learned that making mistakes was part of learning, that struggles made you stronger, that your past didn't determine your future. By the end of the first year, something remarkable happened. The junior orchestra from the Daniel Harper Academy won third place at a regional competition, beating out programs from wealthy suburbs with decades of established excellence. But the real success was measured in transformed lives. Students who had been failing in regular school were now thriving. Kids who had been written off as troublemakers discovered they could channel their energy into artistic expression. Families who had been broken began to heal as they watched their children blossom. Daniel, now 17, wasn't just the Academy's founder and benefactor. He taught classes himself, worked with struggling students during his breaks from his own intensive practice schedule, and performed at fundraising events to keep the program financially stable. Critics sometimes questioned whether he was sacrificing his own artistic development by spending so much time on charity work. But Daniel saw it differently. Every child he helped reminded him of why music mattered, kept him grounded, prevented him from disappearing into the isolated world of celebrity that consumed so many prodigies. On his 18th birthday, Daniel celebrated with a special concert where the entire Academy orchestra performed together. They played a piece he had composed specifically for them called Symphony of Second Chances. It wasn't technically the most difficult music, but it was designed so that every section of the orchestra had moments to shine, so that every student felt essential to the whole. As he conducted his students through the final crescendo, Daniel thought about the boy who had walked into the Belmont Royal Hotel 6 years earlier, desperate and starving. That boy had asked for food and received a future. Now the young man he had become was trying to feed others, not just with bread but with hope, not just with charity but with genuine opportunity. The speech Daniel gave that night became famous, replayed on news programs and shared millions of times online. He spoke without notes, from the heart, his voice carrying the authority of lived experience. He thanked Margaret, who sat in the front row crying happy tears, for seeing him when he was invisible. He thanked Elena for teaching him that discipline and passion weren't opposites, but partners. He thanked his students for reminding him why any of this mattered. But he dedicated the moment to the memory of his father, saying that every note played was a way of keeping him alive, of honoring the gift that had saved his life. He also spoke to every forgotten child watching or listening, the ones still sleeping on benches, the ones stuck in group homes, the ones who felt invisible and worthless. He told them that circumstances were temporary but potential was permanent. He told them that the world needed what they had to offer, even if the world didn't know it yet. He told them to hold on, to keep whatever spark of hope they had burning, because you never knew when one moment, one person, one opportunity could change everything. 3 years later, Daniel Harper was 21 years old and recognized as one of the most influential musicians of his generation. His technical ability had continued to develop under Elena's guidance, but it was his unique perspective, his ability to connect with audiences on a deeply human level, that set him apart. He performed at Carnegie Hall, the same venue where his father had played his last concert before the fatal flight home. The concert was sold out months in advance, with people flying in from around the world to hear the now legendary pianist. But Daniel didn't just perform classical repertoire. He premiered his Piano Concerto No. 1, subtitled From the Streets to the Stars, a 45-minute work that told his story through music. The first movement was dissonant and chaotic, representing the trauma of loss and the confusion of abandonment. The second movement was sparse and lonely, capturing the isolation of homelessness. The third movement began with a single tentative melody, the moment at the hotel piano, that gradually built as more instruments joined, representing the support of Margaret, Elena, and everyone who had helped him rebuild. The final movement was triumphant but also tender, acknowledging both the joy of success and the pain that could never be fully erased. The concerto received mixed reviews from critics, some praising its emotional honesty, while others felt it was too programmatic, too obvious in its storytelling. But audiences loved it. They connected with the raw vulnerability Daniel showed, the willingness to put his pain and triumph into artistic form. The recording went platinum, something almost unheard of for contemporary classical music, and the streaming numbers reached audiences who had never listened to orchestral music before. The Jonathan Harper Academy had become a model that other cities were trying to replicate. Delegations from around the world visited to study the teaching methods that combined artistic excellence with social inclusion. Many of Daniel's first students were now professional musicians themselves, performing in orchestras, teaching in schools, working as music therapists. Some had started their own programs following his example, creating a ripple effect of opportunity that extended far beyond Chicago. Margaret, now 72 years old, had gradually stepped back from managing Daniel's career, but she remained his most trusted advisor and the closest thing to family he had. She often said that discovering Daniel was the most important thing she had ever done in her long career in music journalism. Elena, now in her late 80s, still taught at the academy twice a week, her exacting standards ensuring that compassion never became an excuse for mediocrity. She was fierce in her insistence that these children deserved the best instruction, not condescending charity. Daniel's most ambitious project to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his rediscovery is a global concert streamed online, where hundreds of his students and graduates performed simultaneously from 50 different cities. It was a tribute to music as universal language, but also a demonstration of how an idea born from desperation could grow to touch lives worldwide. The logistics were incredibly complex, with precise timing required so that all the locations could perform together despite time zone differences and technical challenges. But when it worked, when Daniel conducted an orchestra that existed across continents, connected only by technology and shared purpose, it was magical. During the broadcast, which was watched by over 30 million people, Daniel spoke about his journey one more time, but now with the perspective of maturity. He talked about how pain could convert to compassion, how loss could teach the value of what you have, how music could be not just entertainment but medicine for the soul. His voice was firm, confident, that of a man who had transformed personal tragedy into universal mission. The most emotional moment came when he sat at his father's piano, the Steinway that now lived in his private studio. He played the lullaby that Jonathan had composed for his wife, the same melody that had convinced Margaret of his true identity years before. But this time it wasn't a melancholic memory. It was a celebration of love that continues beyond death, of music that connects generations, of talent that transmits not just through genes, but through values. The closing ceremony of the concert was held symbolically at the Belmont Royal Hotel in Chicago, in the same lobby where everything had begun. The Bissendorfer piano was still there, polished like a mirror, and Daniel sat on the same bench where he had sat when he was a desperate and hungry 11-year-old. But this time he didn't play Rachmaninoff, he played an original composition he had written specifically for the occasion, titled The Child Who Dreams. It was a piece that spoke of hope, of infinite possibilities, of how every ending could be a new beginning. The melody was simple enough that even a beginner could play it, but deep enough to move the most experienced musicians. It was designed to be shared, to be learned by children all over the world, to become an anthem for anyone who had ever felt forgotten. As the final notes echoed through the elegant lobby, Daniel thought about the boy who had walked through those doors 10 years before. That boy had asked for a sandwich in exchange for music. Now the man he had become offered music in exchange for a better world, where every child could discover and cultivate their own talents. The story of Daniel Harper had become legend, the lost boy who found himself through music and now helped others do the same. But for him it wasn't just a beautiful story to tell. It was living proof that no matter how dark the situation might seem, there was always a note of hope waiting to be played. And every time a child learned their first scale, every time a young person discovered they could create beauty with their own hands, every time music lit a spark in a lost soul, Daniel knew his father was smiling, because music never dies. It transforms, it grows, and it continues living in the hearts of those who have the courage to share it. The piano fell silent, but the melody continued. It was the sound of the future being born from the past, the promise that every forgotten child could still become the symphony the world was waiting to hear. Daniel stood up from the piano bench and faced the camera streaming to millions of people around the globe. He smiled, not the confident smile of a celebrity, but the genuine smile of someone who had found purpose. Behind him, projected on the wall, were photos of hundreds of children from the academy, each one a testament to the power of believing in potential rather than circumstances. He thought about all the Daniel Harpers out there right now, the kids sleeping on benches, the ones in foster care, the ones who thought nobody saw them or cared. He wanted them to know they weren't invisible. Somewhere, someone was looking. Somewhere, an opportunity was waiting. Somewhere, a melody was calling their name. And all they had to do was find the courage to play it. If this story touched your heart, I need you to do something important right now. Hit that subscribe button because we're building a community of people who believe every child deserves a chance to discover their gifts. But more than that, I want to hear your story. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever discovered a talent you didn't know you had? Has music or art ever saved you during a dark time? Share your experience in the comments below. Let's create a space where everyone's story matters, where we remind each other that circumstances don't define destiny. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who's struggling or who has forgotten their own potential, share this video with them. Sometimes the right story at the right moment can change everything. Let's make sure Daniel's message reaches every child who needs to hear it. Because every person watching this has the power to be someone's Margaret, someone's Elena, someone who sees potential where others see problems. We're not just watching stories here, we're creating a movement of people who refuse to let talent go to waste, who understand that the next genius might be living on a street corner right now. So drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's change the world one story, one child, one chance at a time. I read every single comment and I can't wait to hear how this story affected you.